What happened to your head when you got hit?
Well, my head went back to the left.
Hey, I'm Aaron, and this is Old TV Cinema, where we dig deep into the television that shaped us, scarred us, and occasionally made us spit soda out of our noses. Today we're diving into one of the most successful sitcoms in television history, a show about nothing that somehow became everything: Seinfeld. Fact 15, the pilot was called The Seinfeld Chronicles, and NBC hated it. Let's set the scene. It's 1989. The Berlin Wall is coming down, hairspray is still being used in quantities that were genuinely alarming, and two guys named Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David are sitting around pitching a sitcom to NBC. The concept was simple, almost aggressively simple. A comedian lives in New York City and talks about stuff with his friends. That's it. That's the pitch. The original pilot was called The Seinfeld Chronicles. Not exactly a title that rolls off the tongue, is it? And NBC's test audience agreed. Hard. The audience research report that came back from that pilot screening is now legendary in television circles. Viewers described Jerry as not believable as a lead character. They found George, played by Jason Alexander, to be irritating and whiny. Elaine was not yet in the pilot at all, and the overall response was summarized in the report as, and I'm paraphrasing here, "This show has no legs." One NBC executive reportedly told the team the show would never work because none of the characters were likable, which in hindsight is maybe the funniest note in television history. The entire point of the show turned out to be that the characters were not likable. They were selfish, petty, and hilariously self-absorbed. But in 1989, that wasn't a selling point. That was a red flag. The title was eventually shortened to just Seinfeld, which honestly was the right call because The Seinfeld Chronicles sounds less like a sitcom and more like a Ken Burns documentary about a guy from Queens. The show barely got a second episode order. 4 episodes. That's all NBC committed to initially. 4. We'll come back to how close this whole thing came to dying on the vine when we get to Fact 8. Fact 14, Jerry Seinfeld almost had a co-star. You'd never expect before. Jason Alexander, before Michael Richards, before Julia Louis-Dreyfus made Elaine Beans one of the greatest sitcom characters of all time. The casting process was wide open and a little chaotic. But here's the one that always gets me. Paul Shaffer, best known as David Letterman's band leader and musical sidekick, was actually considered for a role in the early development of the show. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second. Paul Shaffer, the guy in the sparkly blazer with the tinted glasses, trading one-liners with Letterman every night, that Paul Shaffer, nearly ended up in the Seinfeld universe. He was reportedly in discussions for what would eventually become the George Costanza role, or at least a version of the show's central comic foil. Shaffer was a known quantity in New York comedy circles, which made him a logical early consideration. But his commitment to late night with David Letterman made it essentially impossible to make the scheduling work. So Paul Shaffer passed into the what could have been file, and Jason Alexander walked into one of the most iconic roles in television history. And look, I love Paul Shaffer. The man is a legend. But can you imagine that show? Can you actually picture Paul Shaffer doing the Festivus speech, screaming about the jerk store? It doesn't compute. It's one of those beautiful accidents of casting, where the person who didn't get the role was absolutely the right decision, and the person who did get it was absolutely perfect. Sometimes television history hinges on a scheduling conflict. Let that sink in the next time you're trying to get out of a work commitment. Fact 13. George Costanza is based on Larry David, and Larry David knows it. This one is not exactly a secret anymore, but the depth of it still catches people off guard when you lay it all out. George Costanza, the neurotic, bald, stocky, perpetually unemployed, emotionally stunted man-child of the Upper West Side, is Larry David, essentially beat for beat. Larry David has confirmed this himself repeatedly and without much apparent embarrassment, which is honestly the most Larry David thing imaginable. The character's defining traits, the paranoia, the pettiness, the tendency to self-sabotage every good thing that ever happens to him, the obsession with perceived slights, the inexplicable confidence in his own opinions despite all available evidence. All of it came directly from David pulling from his own life. Specific storylines lifted straight from David's real experiences are almost too numerous to list. The famous episode where George pretends to work at Vandelay Industries, based on a real job lie David once told, the episode where George tries to take back a gift, pulled from David's actual life, the marine biologist episode, the shrinkage episode, and on and on. What makes this fascinating is that Jason Alexander initially had no idea. He built the character from his own instincts and, as we'll get to in Fact 3, drew inspiration from somewhere else entirely. When Alexander and David eventually talked more openly about George's origins, Alexander has described it as a slightly surreal experience, essentially being told that the character he'd spent years performing was a direct portrait of the man in the room with him. That's the kind of thing that probably makes for an interesting lunch conversation. Fact 12. The no hugging, no learning rule that changed sitcoms forever. If you want to understand what made Seinfeld genuinely revolutionary, you have to understand the rule that Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld put in place from day one. No hugging, no learning. In the 1980s and early 90s, the dominant grammar of the American sitcom was what you might call the problem and resolution format. A character makes a mistake. By the end of 22 minutes, they have learned from it. There is a hug. There is a lesson. Everyone feels good. That was the template from Family Ties to Full House to Growing Pains. And it worked because audiences found it comfortable and reassuring. Seinfeld burned that template to the ground and did not feel bad about it. The no hugging, no learning rule meant that the characters were explicitly not allowed to grow, change, or become better people as a result of their experiences. Jerry, George, Elaine, and Kramer were going to be exactly who they were at the start of the series when the credits rolled on the final episode. And any writer who pitched a story that ended with a character learning a heartfelt lesson was going to get a very specific look from Larry David. This was a radical creative decision in the context of its era, and it is one of the main reasons the show holds up the way it does. The characters are consistent. They are funny for the same reasons in Season 9 that they were funny in Season 3. There's no arc to track, no redemption to root for. You just show up and watch four deeply flawed people navigate a world they are entirely unsuited for. And you laugh because you recognize yourself in the worst version of them. That is not an accident. That is a very deliberately maintained creative philosophy. Fact 11. Julia Louis-Dreyfus almost didn't get the part. Elaine Benes is, by any reasonable measure, one of the greatest female characters in the history of American television. The dancing, the shove, the exclamation points, the complete inability to tolerate anyone around her, while also desperately needing them. Julia Louis-Dreyfus brought something to that role that is genuinely hard to quantify, and the show would have been an entirely different animal without her. Which is why it is slightly terrifying to learn how close they came to casting someone else entirely. The original pilot, as we mentioned, did not feature Elaine at all. The character was added later when producers determined the show needed a female presence in the core group. Several actresses came in to read for the role. The specifics of who exactly auditioned have varied depending on who's telling the story. But what's consistent across multiple accounts is that the decision was not as obvious as it seems in hindsight. Louis-Dreyfus was a Saturday Night Live alumna at the time, which should have been a gold star on her resume, but SNL in the mid to late 1980s had a complicated reputation. Not every cast member translated to other formats, and there was some uncertainty about whether she could anchor a network sitcom role rather than sketch comedy. She got the part. And then she went on to win more Emmy Awards than any performer in television history for a single role. So I think we can safely say that particular casting decision worked out. The show also had a no asking wives and girlfriends for their opinions policy in the writer's room, which is completely separate, but equally telling about the culture of that set. Fact 10. Michael Richards invented Kramer's entrance on the spot. Cosmo Kramer, the hair, the vintage shirts, the sliding entrance through Jerry's apartment door that became one of the most recognizable physical comedy bits in television history. Here's what you probably didn't know. That entrance was not in the script. Michael Richards developed the character's physical signature essentially on his own, drawing on his background in physical comedy and his instincts about who Kramer was as a person. The idea that Kramer would burst through the door at full speed, slide to a stop, and immediately command the attention of every person in the room, that was Richards figuring out how to make an entrance that matched the energy of the character. And the live studio audience response to it in the early episodes essentially locked it in permanently. The laugh that Kramer's entrance got from real people sitting in those seats told the producers everything they needed to know. You don't mess with something that gets that reaction before a single line of dialogue has been delivered. Richards has talked about the physical work that went into Kramer, the loose-limbed, rubber-boned quality of the way the character moved through every scene. It was not accidental looseness. It was precisely calibrated looseness, which is a much harder thing to execute than it looks. Anyone who has ever tried to be intentionally clumsy on cue will tell you that. The entrance itself became a kind of shorthand for the whole show, something unexpected barging in and immediately disrupting whatever was happening. That is Seinfeld, in a single physical gesture, and Michael Richards invented it by instinct. Give that man his credit. Fact 9, the Soup Nazi was a real person. Of all the characters who ever appeared in the Seinfeld universe, the Soup Nazi may be the one who crossed most completely from fiction into reality, and the reason for that is simple. He was barely fictional to begin with. Al Yeganay ran a soup kitchen on West 55th Street in Manhattan called Soup Kitchen International. In real life, as in the show, he was a gifted cook who made extraordinary soup, maintained an extremely rigid ordering process, and had precisely zero tolerance for customers who failed to follow his rules. No small talk. No deviating from the ordering sequence. Get it wrong, and you were out. Next, the episode, which aired in 1995, turned his real-life restaurant into the most famous soup stand in America overnight. Lines went around the block. Yeganay's business exploded, and then he watched the episode. He was furious. Genuinely, deeply furious. Yeganay objected strenuously to the Nazi label, which, fair point when you think about it, he felt the portrayal was disrespectful, and that the show had made a mockery of his craft and his business. He reportedly refused to acknowledge the connection publicly for years and was openly hostile to any journalist who brought it up. The actor who played him, Larry Thomas, delivered one of the most iconic guest performances in sitcom history. Yeganay eventually softened somewhat over the years, even appearing on the Today Show at one point to promote a soup business venture. But the relationship between the real man and his fictional counterpart remained complicated. This happens when a television show turns your specific personality quirks into a cultural catchphrase. No soup for you is probably not what you want on your tombstone when you spent your life perfecting butternut squash bisque. Fact 8, NBC passed on the show. Twice we touched on this earlier, and I promise we'd come back to it. Here's the full story, because it is genuinely remarkable. After the test, audience numbers came back on the Seinfeld Chronicles pilot. An NBC executive named Rick Ludwin made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American television. He believed in the show enough to fund 4 additional episodes out of his own department's budget. His department handled late-night and specials programming, not sitcoms. He essentially reached into the wrong budget line to keep this show alive because he thought it was worth it. The sitcom development team at NBC at the time reportedly had little interest in the show. The feedback was consistent. The characters were unlikable. The format was unclear. There was no premise in the traditional sense. One executive, whose name has appeared in various accounts of this period, allegedly said the show would never find an audience. 4 episodes aired, then a handful more. Then slowly, through word of mouth and critical appreciation, the audience started to find it. By season 3 and 4, the numbers were climbing. By the time the show hit its peak in the mid-90s, it was the #1 show on American television. Rick Ludwin has given interviews about this over the years, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew something other people didn't. He used budget money designated for holiday specials and variety programming to save Seinfeld, which means in some alternate universe, we got one more Bob Hope Christmas special, and no Seinfeld. The fact that we are not living in that universe is something I am personally very grateful for. Fact 7. The Puerto Rican Day Parade episode got the show banned. Seinfeld was not a show that courted controversy as a rule. Its humor was observational, neurotic, and largely self-contained within the bubble of the character's own absurd logic. But in 1998, in the show's final season, they produced an episode called The Puerto Rican Day that landed like a grenade in a very specific and very real community. The episode featured the gang stuck in traffic during New York City's Puerto Rican Day parade. In one scene, Kramer accidentally sets fire to a Puerto Rican flag and then stomps on it to put the flames out. This was not received well. That is the most enormous understatement I could possibly make about what happened next. The National Puerto Rican Coalition and multiple advocacy groups responded immediately and with significant force. They called the episode offensive, stereotyping, and demeaning. NBC issued a formal apology, which is not something networks did casually in the 1990s. The episode was pulled from its planned rerun schedule and stayed out of syndication for years. When it eventually returned to circulation, it came with some level of acknowledgement of the controversy. The show's creators maintained that the intent was never to demean Puerto Rican culture, and that the humor was aimed at the character's own ignorance rather than the parade or its participants. That argument landed differently depending on who you asked. The episode remains one of the most debated in the show's history, not because it is representative of what Seinfeld was, but precisely because it wasn't. It was the one moment where the show's willingness to push into uncomfortable territory crossed a line that a significant number of people found genuinely hurtful. That matters, even for a show about nothing. Fact 6. Larry David quit the show in season 7, then came back. This one genuinely shocked me the first time I read about it in depth. Larry David, co-creator of Seinfeld, the man whose personal neuroses essentially built the show from the ground up, quit mid-run after season 7. David had been running the writer's room and acting as showrunner since the beginning. By 1996, he was burned out, creatively and personally. He stepped away from his day-to-day role on the show, handing the reins to other writers and producers. He stayed involved in some capacity, but the active, in-the-room, rewriting everything himself version of Larry David was gone. Season 8 of Seinfeld is widely considered by fans and critics to be the weakest of the later seasons. Not bad television, to be clear, still funnier than 90% of what was on the air, but missing something. The specific texture of Larry David's sensibility that had shaped every storyline up to that point. Then something remarkable happened. David agreed to come back for one more season. He returned to write the series finale, essentially because he and Jerry Seinfeld agreed that the show's ending should be handled by the people who started it. The finale, as we'll get to in Fact 4, is one of the most controversial last episodes in television history. But the fact that David came back to write it at all is a testament to what the show meant to him, even after he'd decided he was done. Some things you can't fully walk away from. Apparently, Seinfeld was one of them for Larry David. Fact 5. The cast turned down $100 million. Eunch. Let me say that number out loud one more time for the people in the back. $100 million. Each. That is what NBC offered Jerry Seinfeld and the main cast members to continue the show for a 10th season, and they said no. By 1997, Seinfeld was the most valuable piece of programming on American television. The network's Thursday night lineup was built around it. Advertisers were paying record rates for commercial spots. The syndication money was already astronomical. NBC was in full panic mode at the idea of losing it. The offer to Jerry Seinfeld personally was reported at the time as $5 million per episode, which across a 22-episode season adds up to a number that requires scientific notation. Similar offers were made to the main cast. The financial incentive to keep going was, by any normal human measure, incomprehensible. Jerry Seinfeld turned it down. He has been remarkably consistent and clear about his reasoning in the years since. He believed the show was at its peak and that the right time to end something is when it's still great, not when it's starting to fade. He did not want to be the show that kept going until people were relieved it was finally over. He had watched that happen to other shows. He did not want it for his. You can agree or disagree with the decision, but you cannot argue with the logic. Seinfeld ended as the #1 show on television. How many shows can say that? Fact 4. The finale was watched by 76 million people, and almost everyone hated it. 76 million people watched the Seinfeld finale on May 14, 1998. That is the kind of number that does not exist in television anymore. Not even close. It was the third most watched finale in American television history at that point, behind the MASH finale and the Cheers finale. And then the reviews came in, and then the audience reactions came in. And it became very clear, very fast, that the people who watched it and the people who made it were not on the same page. Larry David's finale brought back essentially every significant recurring character from the show's 9-year run to watch Jerry, George, Elaine, and Kramer stand trial for failing to help a stranger being robbed. The trial format allowed previous characters to testify about the gang's many moral failures over the years. It was David's way of literalizing the no-hugging, no-learning philosophy. These 4 people never changed. Here is the evidence. The jury finds them guilty of being exactly who they always were. Audiences found it cold, too clever, more interested in its own concept than in giving fans a satisfying goodbye to characters they loved. Critics were divided. Some understood exactly what David was doing and respected it. Others felt the finale betrayed the emotional investment viewers had built over a decade. David has defended the ending consistently and without apparent regret. His position is essentially that a show which never did sentiment shouldn't end with sentiment, which is completely logical. And yet, I have talked to people who are still annoyed about that finale, 20-something years later. That's its own kind of legacy. Fact 3. Jason Alexander based George on Woody Allen, not Larry David. Here is where the George Costanza origin story gets genuinely interesting. We established in Fact 13 that Larry David is the real-life inspiration for George Costanza. Larry David confirmed it. The evidence is overwhelming. It is not a matter of debate, but here's the thing. Jason Alexander didn't know that when he was building the character, and the person he chose to draw from was Woody Allen. Alexander has explained this in multiple interviews over the years. When he read the pilot script and tried to find the internal logic of who George was, the reference point that made the most sense to him was the Woody Allen persona. The neurotic, the self-loathing, intellectually pretentious but deeply insecure New York Jewish man navigating a world that seemed specifically designed to frustrate him. That template fit George like a glove. So Alexander built the character from Allen's screen persona. Larry David built the character from his own life. And by some remarkable convergence, they arrived at the same place. Because Woody Allen's screen persona was, in a meaningful sense, drawn from the same New York experience and psychological profile that shaped Larry David. They were pulling from overlapping wells without knowing it. When Alexander and David eventually talked about this openly, it created one of those delightful moments where 2 creative processes that developed independently turned out to be describing the same thing. George Costanza is Larry David as filtered through Woody Allen, as interpreted by Jason Alexander. That's a sentence I genuinely enjoy having written. Fact 2. The show accidentally predicted the future, more than once. Seinfeld ran from 1989 to 1998. The internet, as most people use it today, did not exist during most of that run. Smartphones did not exist. Social media did not exist. Streaming television did not exist. And yet, the episode called The Cartoon, in which a character becomes obsessed with whether people are laughing at a joke they posted, is a fairly precise description of the psychological experience of posting something on social media and refreshing compulsively to see the response. The episode called The Pilot, in which Jerry and George develop a television show based on their own lives, is essentially a description of the prestige television model of personal auteur-driven content that defines streaming culture today. Making a show about nothing from your own neurotic experiences is now the dominant creative template. Seinfeld was there first. The episode called The Phone Message, from the very early seasons, deals with the anxiety of leaving recorded messages and the desperate desire to take back something you said. The emotional logic of that episode maps directly onto the experience of sending a text message you immediately regret. The technology changed, the human behavior did not. And the episode called The Jerk Store, which involves George spending enormous energy crafting the perfect comeback to something that happened days ago, has been cited so many times as a metaphor for internet argument culture that it has essentially become a sociological reference point. The show was not predicting the future, It was documenting something true about human nature that technology later gave new surfaces to express itself on. That's actually a better trick than prediction. Fact 1. The real reason the show ended. It wasn't what you think. Here's what most people know. Jerry Seinfeld chose to end the show. He turned down the money. He wanted to go out on top. That's the official version, and it is true as far as it goes. Here's what gets left out of that version. By 1997, the atmosphere on the set and in the writer's room had become genuinely difficult, not in a screaming matches way, more in an everything is harder than it used to be way. The pressure of being the #1 show on television for multiple consecutive seasons is not a comfortable pressure. Every episode was scrutinized. Every creative decision was second-guessed from outside the room. The standard the show had set for itself was, by its final seasons, almost impossible to maintain. Michael Richards has spoken in various contexts about the physical and creative demands of the show by its final years. Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Jason Alexander were both, by multiple accounts, ready for the experience to be over, even as they loved the work itself. The ensemble was still brilliant, the chemistry was still there. But 9 years is a long time to be inside any creative pressure cooker, and this one was set exceptionally high. Jerry Seinfeld has also spoken candidly about the fact that he simply did not want to spend his life being Jerry Seinfeld, the sitcom character. He was a stand-up comedian. That was his identity. The show had consumed his public persona in a way that he was ready to step back from. He wanted his life back. Not from failure, which would have been easy to understand, but from enormous success, which is a stranger and harder thing to explain to people. Larry David's departure after season 7 had changed the show in ways that were hard to fully articulate, but easy to feel. When David came back for the finale, it wasn't a triumphant return so much as a closing of the circle. The man who built it with Jerry was going to be there when the lights went out. And then they went out, on top, at 76 million viewers, with the characters in jail, unrepentant and exactly who they have always been. No hugging, no learning. That was always the point. And that is 15 weird facts about Seinfeld that you maybe didn't fully know. I'm Aaron, this is Old TV Cinema, and if you've made it this far, you clearly have excellent taste in both television and YouTube channels.
So, what are you saying?
I'm saying...
Trust me, we've got some good ones in the pipeline. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.